Not to be rich, not to be famous, not to be mighty, not even to be happy, but to be civilized. That was the dream of his life. What the qualities of such a life were he could not have articulated when he left his father's house, or shack, in the northern woods of the state. His plan was to travel all the way down to Chicago to find out. He knew for sure what he didn't want, and that was to live like a savage. His own father was a fierce and ignorant man, a trapper, then a lumberman, and at the end of his life, a watchman at the iron mines. His mother was a hard-working woman with a slavish nature who could never conceive of wanting anything other than what she had, or if she did, if she was really other than she seemed, she felt it was not prudent to speak of her desires in front of her husband. One of Willard's strongest boyhood recollections is of the time a full-blooded Chippewa squaw came to their cabin with a root for his sister to chew when Ginny was incandescent with scarlet fever. Willard was 7, and Ginny was 1, and the squaw, as Willard tells it today, was over 100. The delirious little girl did not die of the disease, though Willard was later to understand his father to believe it would have been better if she had. In only a few years they were to discover that poor little Ginny could not learn to add 2 and 2, or to recite in their order the days of the week. Whether this was a consequence of the fever, or she had been born that way, nobody was ever to know. Willard never forgot the brutality of that occurrence, which for him lay in the fact that nothing was to be done, for all that was happening to a 1-year-old child. What was happening, this was more his sense of it at the time, was even deeper than his eyes. In the process of discovering his personal attractiveness, the 7-year-old had lately discovered that what someone had at first denied him would sometimes be conceded if only he looked into the other's eyes long enough for the honesty and intensity of his desire to be appreciated, for it to be understood that it wasn't just something he wanted, but something he needed. His success, though meager at home, was considerable at the school in Iron City, where the young lady teacher had taken a great liking to the effervescent, good-humored, and bright little boy. The night Ginny lay moaning in her crib, Willard did everything he could to catch his father's attention, but the man only continued spooning down his dinner. And when finally he spoke, it was to tell the child to stop shuffling and gaping and to eat his food. But Willard could not swallow a single mouthful. Again he concentrated. Again he brought all his emotion up into his eyes, wished with all his heart, and a pure, selfless wish, too, nothing for himself. Never would he wish anything for himself again, and fixed his plea on his mother. But all she did was to turn away and cry. Later, when his father stepped out of the shack and his mother took the dishes to the tub, he moved across the darkened room to the corner where Ginny lay. He put his hand into the crib. The cheek he touched felt like a sack of hot water. Down by the baby's burning toes he found the root the Indian woman had brought to them that morning. Carefully, he wrapped Ginny's fingers around it, but they unbent the moment he let go. He picked up the root and pressed it to her lips. "Here," he said, as though beckoning to an animal to eat from his hand. He was forcing it between her gums when the door opened. "You! Let her be! Get away!" And so, helpless, he went off to his bed and had, at 7, his first terrifying inkling that there were in the universe forces even more immune to his charm, even more remote from his desires, even more estranged from human need and feeling than his own father. Ginny lived with her parents until the end of her mother's life. Then Willard's father, an old hulk of a thing by this time, moved into a room in Iron City, and Ginny was taken to Beckstown, off in the northwestern corner of the state, where the home for the feeble-minded used to be. It was nearly a month before the news of what his father had done reached Willard. Over his own wife's objections, he got into the car that very evening and drove most of the night. At noon the following day he returned home with Ginny, not to Chicago, but to the town of Liberty Center, which is 150 miles down the river from Iron City, and as far south as Willard had gotten when, at the age of 18, he had decided to journey out into the civilized world. Since the war, The country town that Liberty Center used to be has given way more and more to the suburb of Winnesaw it will eventually become. But when Willard first came to settle, there was not even a bridge across the Slade River connecting Liberty Center on the east shore to the county seat on the west. To get to Winnesaw, you had to take a ferry ride from the landing, or, in deep winter, walk across the ice. Liberty Center was a town of small white houses shaded by big elms and maples, with a bandstand in the middle of Broadway, its main street. Bounded on the west by the pale flow of river, it opens out on the east to dairy country, which in the summer of 1903, when Willard arrived, was so deeply green it reminded him, a joke for the amusement of the young, of a fellow he once saw at a picnic who had eaten a pound of bad potato salad. Until he came down from the north, outside of town, had always meant to him the towering woods rolling up to Canada, and the weather roaring down, waves of wind, of hail, of rain and snow, and town meant Iron City, where the logs were brought to be milled and the ore to be dumped into boxcars, the clanging, buzzing, swarming, dusty frontier town to which he walked each school day, or in winter, when he went off in a raw morning dimness, ran, through woods aswarm with bear and wolf. So at the sight of Liberty Center, its quiet beauty, its serene order, its gentle summery calm, all that had been held in check in him, all that tenderness of heart that had been for 18 years his secret burden, even at times his shame, came streaming forth. If ever there was a place where life could be less bleak and harsh and cruel than the life he had known as a boy, if ever there was a place where a man did not have to live like a brute, where he did not have to be reminded at every turn that something in the world either did not like mankind or did not even know of its existence, it was here. Liberty Center. Oh, sweet name. At least for him, for he was indeed free at last of that terrible tyranny of cruel men and cruel nature. He found a room, then he found a job. He took an examination and scored high enough to become postal clerk. Then he found a wife, a strong-minded and respectable girl from a proper family. And then he had a child, and then one day, the fulfillment, he discovered, of a very deep desire. He bought a house of his own, with a front porch and a backyard, downstairs a parlor, a dining room, a kitchen and a bedroom, upstairs 2 bedrooms more, and the bath. A back bathroom was built downstairs in 1915, 6 years after the birth of his daughter, and following his promotion to assistant postmaster of the town. In 1962, the sidewalk out front had to be replaced, a whacking expense for a man now on a government pension, but one that had to be, for the pavement had buckled in half a dozen places and become a hazard to passers-by. Indeed, to this very day, when his famous agility, or jumpiness, has all but disappeared, when several times in an afternoon he finds himself in a chair which he cannot remember having settled into, awakening from a sleep he cannot remember needing, when at night to undo his laces produces a groan he does not even hear, when in his bed he tries for minutes on end to roll his fingers into a fist, and sometimes must go off to sleep having failed in the attempt, when at the end of each month he looks at the fresh new calendar page and understands that there on the pantry door is the month and the year in which he will most assuredly die. That one of those big black numerals over which his eye is slowly moving is the date upon which he is to disappear forever from the world. He nevertheless continues to attend as quickly as he is able to a weak porch rail, or the dripping of a spigot in the bathroom, or a tack come loose from the runner in the hall, and all this to maintain not only the comfort of those who live with him yet, but the dignity of all too, such as it is. One afternoon in November of 1954, a week before Thanksgiving, and just at dusk, Willard Carroll drove out to Clark's Hill, parked down by the fence, and on foot climbed the path until he reached the family plot. The wind was growing colder and stronger by the minute, so that by the time he had reached the top of the hill, The bare trees, whose limbs had only been clicking together when he left the car, were now giving off a deep, groaning sound. The sky swirling overhead had a strange light to it, though below it already appeared to be night. Of the town he was able to discern little more than the black line of the river and the headlamps of the cars as they moved along Water Street toward the Winnesaw Bridge. As though this of all places had been his destination, Willard sank down onto the cold block of bench that faced the two stones, raised the collar of his red hunting jacket, pulled on the flaps of his cap, and there, before the graves of his sister Ginny and his granddaughter Lucy, and the rectangles reserved for the rest of them, he waited. It began to snow. Waiting for what? The stupidity of his behavior dawned quickly. The bus he had left the house to meet would be pulling up back of Van Harn's store in a few minutes. From it, Whitey was going to disembark, suitcase in hand, whether his father-in-law sat here in a freezing cemetery or not. Everything was in readiness for the homecoming, which Willard had himself helped to bring about. So what now? Back out? Change his mind? Let Whitey find himself another sponsor or sucker? That's right. Oh, that's it exactly. Let it get dark, let it get cold, and just sit it out in the falling snow. And the bus will pull in, and the fellow will get off and head into the waiting room, all brimming over with how he has taken someone in once again, only to find that this time no sucker named Willard is waiting in the waiting room. But at home, Berta was preparing a dinner for 4. On the way out the kitchen door to the garage, Willard had kissed her on the cheek. "It's going to be all right, Mrs. Carroll." But he might have been talking to himself for all the response he received. As a matter of fact, that's who he was talking to. He had backed the car down the driveway and looked up to the second floor, where his daughter Myra was rushing around her room so as to be bathed and dressed when her father and her husband came through the door. But saddest of all, most confusing of all, a little light was on in Lucy's room. Only the week before, Myra had pushed the bed from one end of the room to the other and taken down the curtains that had hung there all those years, and then gone out and bought a new bedspread so that at least it no longer looked like the room in which Lucy had slept, or tried to sleep, the last night she had ever spent in the house. Of course, on the subject of how and where Whitey was to spend his nights, what could Willard do but be silent? Secretly, it was a relief that Whitey was to be on trial in this way. If only it could have been in a bed other than that one. And over in Winnesaw, Willard's old friend and lodge brother, Bud Dormus, was expecting Whitey to show up for work at his hardware supply house first thing Monday morning. The arrangements with Bud dated back to the summer, when Willard had agreed to accept his son-in-law once again into his house, if only for a while. Only for a while was the guarantee he had made to Berta, because she was right. This just could not be a repetition of 1934, with someone in need coming for a short stay and managing somehow to stretch it out to 16 years of living off the fat of another fellow's land, which wasn't so fat